She practically robbed us blind. What Blake didn't know was whose money ran his fund, and he'd find out by the end of the quarter. The gavel wasn't a gavel. It was Blake's signet ring cracking down on the granite bar of the Chesapeake Grill, twice, hard, to get the room to look at him. 40 people turned. My glass of Sancerre sweated in my hand, and I could smell the crab cakes going cold on the buffet, that sweet Old Bay smell, and somewhere behind me, a dropped fork rang against the floor like a bell. "Let's just say it plainly," Blake said, and he smiled the way he smiled when he closed a deal. "Imogen came to us with a story. We trusted her, and she practically robbed us blind. 200 grand, gone." He let that sit. "So no, she is not welcome at this table, not after what she did to Junie." Junie wouldn't look at me. My best friend of 19 years stared down into her drink like it held the answer, and her silence was the loudest thing in that room. I set my glass down without a sound. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just memorized the shape of every face nodding along. None of them knew that the money that paid for Blake's whole shining life, the fund, the boat, the ring he'd just cracked on the granite, ran on a single anonymous investor's capital. They didn't know her name was buried under 3 layers of holding company. They didn't know I was looking at her in the mirror behind the bar. That was February. He had until the end of the quarter. He just didn't know it yet. Let me back all the way up, because the shame only makes sense if you know how far it fell. I grew up in a rented half of a duplex on Old Solomon's Road, outside Annapolis, Maryland, where the porch light flickered because the socket was loose and my father never fixed it, just called it the lighthouse and left it. My mother cleaned rooms at a Days Inn off Route 50 for $7.10 an hour when I was in high school. We were not poor in the dramatic way. We were poor in the arithmetic way, the way where you know to the dollar what's in the account, and you round the gas pump down to leave a buffer. The one beautiful thing we owned was my grandfather's ship in a bottle. He'd built it on a merchant tanker in 1961, a 3-masted clipper wedged inside a green glass Chianti bottle, the glass smudged with 60 years of fingerprints and pipe smoke, so the little ship always looked like it was sailing through fog. He gave it to me the summer before he died. "You'll understand it later," he said, "how you get something that big through a neck that small. Patience and rigging. You build it flat, then you pull one thread and it all stands up at once." I was 9. I kept it on every windowsill of every place I ever lived. I was good with numbers the way some kids are good with a ball. Not showy, just relentless. I put myself through the University of Maryland with 2 jobs and graduated in 2004 with a finance degree and $19,000 in loans. I paid off in 4 years by living on rice and spite. I got a job as a junior analyst at a regional shop, then a bigger one in Baltimore. I was the woman who read the footnotes. I found a rounding fraud in a municipal bond package in 2009 that saved my firm $4 million and got me exactly 1 handshake and no bonus, because the man above me put his name on it. I learned the lesson. The person whose name is on the paper wins. So I started making sure it was mine. By 2015, I'd built something quiet. I ran my own money and a little bit of other people's under a plain LLC. I never posted about it. I drove a 9-year-old Honda Accord that took 2 turns of the key on cold mornings. The neighbors thought I did something with taxes. The whole point, the thing I learned from my grandfather without knowing I'd learned it, was that you build the ship flat, inside, where nobody can see it, and you don't pull the thread until every line is set. Junie was my anchor through all of it. Junie Alvarado, since Mrs. Petrarca's 10th grade homeroom. The girl who split her lunch with me for a year and never once made it feel like charity. She was the warm one, the one who remembered everyone's birthday, who cried at commercials, who believed people. When she believed in you, you felt chosen. That was her gift, and it turned out her wound. She met Blake Renner in 2016 at a wine auction for the Annapolis Maritime Museum. Blake was tan and easy and 41, with a laugh he could aim. He ran a small investment fund, Tidewater Partners, out of an office on Dock Street with a view of the harbor and a receptionist named Colleen. He wore boat shoes with no socks in a way that told you he wanted you to notice he didn't care. He called me the brains at dinner, and the first 100 times it sounded like a compliment. The early years were genuinely good. I want to be honest about that, because it's the good years that make the con work. Blake threw a party the night he and Junie got engaged and toasted her in front of 60 people so tenderly that I teared up. He learned I liked bourbon and kept Angel's Envy in the cabinet just for me. When my mother had her stroke in 2018, Blake drove me to the hospital at 2 a.m. and sat in the plastic chair all night and didn't say a single dumb thing, which is its own kind of grace. I loved him then. Not romantically, as family. Junie's husband, my friend. He knew I had money. He didn't know how much, and I never told him, because I'd learned young to keep the real number in a locked room. He knew I did well. That was enough for him to start circling, though it took me years to see the circle for what it was. The first wrong note was small. It's always small. Thanksgiving 2019, at their house on Chinkapin Round, Blake was carving the turkey and telling a story about a client, a widow named Mrs. Delano, who'd gotten emotional and pulled her money at a bad time. "People panic," he said, sawing at the bird. "You have to protect them from themselves." Everyone laughed, but I'd caught the specific way he said it, like the widow's fear was an inconvenience to him, not a signal. I filed it. I didn't know I was filing it. I just felt the cabinet drawer of my attention slide open and shut. Second note, spring 2020. Blake bought a 42-foot Sabre yacht, the Second Wind, and moored it at the Annapolis Yacht Club during a stretch when he'd told Junie they had to cancel their trip to Lisbon because of cash flow. I remember Junie saying it to me on the phone, apologizing like it was her fault, and I remember the boat slip fee because Junie mentioned it in passing. $1,850 a month, and I thought, cash flow. I said nothing. You don't blow up your best friend's marriage over a boat. Third note, and this one I should have shouted about. Fall 2021, at a barbecue, Blake was 3 beers in and holding court about Tidewater's returns. He said the fund had 13% net 3 years running. Now, I read footnotes for a living. I'd seen Tidewater's marketing one-pager because Junie had proudly shown me. And I knew, cold, certain, the way I know my own phone number, that a fund of his size in those years, in those instruments, did not clear 13 net without either extraordinary luck or a story. There was no news of extraordinary luck. So there was a story. I watched him tell it, watched Junie glow beside him, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very quiet. That stillness is my tell. It's the same stillness I get right before I find the fraud in the footnote. Fourth note, December 2022. Blake started asking me questions, casual ones, over dinner. How did I structure things? Whether I ever brought in outside capital. He framed it as flattery. You're the smartest person I know with money, Imogen. I should be learning from you. And I, who spent my whole life reading people's real intentions in their subordinate clauses, let it slide, because he was Junie's husband and I wanted, I think, to be seen by him, to be the brains in the good way, for once. That's the part I've had to forgive myself for. The con didn't work because I was stupid. It worked because I wanted to be family so badly I turned off the one instrument that had never failed me. Here is how the trap closed, not suddenly, in stages, like water rising in a slip. In early 2023, Blake brought me a deal, a co-investment, he called it, alongside Tidewater, a private placement in a firm called Harbor Reach Logistics, a last-mile shipping outfit expanding into 3 mid-Atlantic ports. He had a whole deck, Real letterhead, a real-looking cap table, a projected 22% IRR, a 2-year horizon. And here was the hook, the thing that turned my key. Junie was in it. "We put in 150 of our own," Blake said. "I wouldn't touch it if I wasn't putting Junie's future in it too." And Junie, my Junie, sat across the table at Carpaccio on Main Street and took my hand and said, "Imogen, I've never seen him this careful. I checked it myself. I wouldn't tell you to do this if I hadn't." She vouched. That's the word that mattered. She vouched, with her whole open heart, because Blake had shown her exactly what she needed to see to vouch. I put in $200,000. Not because I couldn't read the deck. I could, and it had rough spots. But rough spots are normal, and Junie's face was not a rough spot. Junie's face was collateral I trusted more than any audited statement. I wired it on March 9th, 2023, from an account I actually used, not one of the quiet ones. $200,000 into an escrow account for Harbor Reach Logistics that Blake set up. For 4 months, there were updates, glossy PDFs, a first close, a photo of a warehouse in Chesapeake, Virginia. Then, in August, the delay. Then, in October, the restructuring. Then, in December, the sentence every conned person eventually hears, delivered by Blake on the phone in a voice full of sorrow. "Imogen, I don't know how to tell you this. Harbor Reach is insolvent. The principals walked. We lost everything, too. Junie's crying as I'm telling you this." I sat very still. The ship in a bottle was on the windowsill in front of me, the little clipper fogged in its old green glass, and I looked at it while Blake performed his grief into my ear, and the stillness came over me like it always does, because I'd already, quietly, 2 weeks earlier, done the thing Blake never imagined the brains would do. I'd pulled the corporate filings on Harbor Reach Logistics from the Virginia State Corporation Commission, and Harbor Reach Logistics, LLC, had been formed on January 30th, 2023, 5 weeks before Blake pitched me, by an organizer whose registered agent address matched a UPS store box that also served as the registered agent for 2 shell entities tied to Tidewater. The principals, who walked, had never existed as anything but a name on a page. There was no shipping company. There was a bottle with no ship in it. Blake had built an empty deck, and I had wired $200,000 into it, and now he was crying about it into my ear. But here's what turned grief into war. 2 weeks after that phone call at a fund investor dinner Junie hosted, Blake got ahead of the story. He told the room, Tidewater's clients, the very people whose money he managed, that the Harbor Reach deal had been brought to him by me, that I had sourced it, that I had pressured him and Junie into it, leaned on the friendship, and that when it collapsed, I'd tried to claw my money back ahead of everyone else, including Junie. He flipped it. The swindler became the swindled. He made himself and Junie my victims, and people believed him. Of course they did. He was the man with the boat and the ring and the 13% story. I was something with taxes. Within a month, I was getting looks at the Giant on Forest Drive. A woman I'd known for a decade turned her cart around in the cereal aisle. Junie stopped answering my texts. Blake had a lawyer send me a letter, actual letterhead, a man named Pruitt, warning me to cease making defamatory statements about Mr. Renner's business or face suit. The system, the whole polite machinery of it, lined up behind him. He'd gotten there first, and the person who gets there first, with the confident story, wins. Which brings us to that night at the Chesapeake Grill, the signet ring on the granite. She practically robbed us blind. Junie not looking at me, 40 people nodding. I want to tell you I stood up and torched the room. I didn't. I set my glass down and I left, and I drove my 9-year-old Accord home. It started on the second turn. It always did in the cold. and I sat in my kitchen with the flickering, not-fixed porch light of a rental I no longer lived in, living only in my memory. And I looked at the ship-in-a-bottle on the sill, and I did not cry. I made a phone call. Her name is Dale Okonkwo, my attorney for 11 years, a woman who bills $650 an hour and is worth $6,500, who keeps a jar of black licorice on her desk that nobody else will eat. I called her at 9:40 p.m. and she picked up on the second ring because that's who she is. He said it in front of 40 people, I told her. He said I robbed them. Okay, Dale said. I heard her sit down. I heard a pen click. Are you crying? No. Good. Then this is going to be fun. Tell me everything, in order, and don't leave out the parts that make you look dumb. Those are the load-bearing parts. Here is the thing Blake never understood. The ship inside the bottle, the reason the whole con was doomed from a date 2 years before he pitched me. In 2021, Tidewater Partners had needed capital. Not client money, its own operating leverage, the base of institutional money that let Blake tell everyone he managed over $80 million and borrow and lever against it. Small funds like his live or die on one thing: a cornerstone limited partner, a big, quiet investor whose committed capital anchors the whole structure and lets the fund take on credit lines many times that size. Without the cornerstone, the leverage collapses, and the fund is just a man with a boat. Blake found his cornerstone in the summer of 2021. An anonymous limited partner committing $22 million through a Delaware entity called Keel Point Holdings, which committed through a fund of one called Meridian Reach, which was owned by a trust, which was advised by an LLC in Baltimore that read footnotes for a living. I was the cornerstone. I was the anonymous limited partner whose $22 million commitment his entire fund ran on. Blake's leverage, his credit lines, his over $80 million, his boat, his ring, his 13% story, all of it stood up on capital that was, at the bottom of 3 holding companies, mine. He'd been so proud when he landed Keel Point. He used to mention it at dinner. We brought on a serious institutional LP last year, changes everything, never knowing he was bragging to her about herself. I'd invested through the trust years before he married Junie, before I ever imagined he'd matter, back when Tidewater was just a promising little fund my Baltimore advisor flagged, and I liked the harbor view. It was a small position for me, a rounding error, honestly. I'd half forgotten it was even Blake's fund until Junie married into it, and then I'd kept it quiet, the way I keep everything quiet, because you never, ever tell a man like Blake what you really are. He'd conned the brains. He'd conned his own cornerstone. He'd built his whole ship flat inside my bottle and never once looked at the neck. Dale, I said that night, how fast can an anchor LP lawfully exit and call in what she's owed? I heard her smile. Depends what the partnership agreement says. Send me everything. And Imogen, do it clean. Do it so clean that when it's over, there's not one thing he can point to and call theft. Let the paper do it. We did it clean. It took 11 weeks, and it was the most disciplined thing I have ever done. First, we did nothing loud. Not one lawyer letter back to Pruitt. Not one defensive text. Silence, which the con man reads as retreat. Blake thought he'd won. He got bolder. He told 2 more people I'd have to answer for it eventually. Good. Every word he said was rigging I could pull later. Second, Dale and I read the Tidewater Limited Partnership Agreement the way my grandfather read a bottle's neck, for the one path in. Blake, in his arrogance, had drafted terms in 2021 that heavily favored his cornerstone LP, because in 2021 he'd been desperate to land the money. There was a redemption clause. The anchor LP could give notice and withdraw committed capital at the end of any fiscal quarter with 60 days written notice. There was a key person and material misrepresentation clause. If the general partner made a material misrepresentation to any investor, the anchor LP could accelerate and call the full commitment immediately. And there was an audit rights clause. As a 20+% LP, I was entitled, on demand, to the fund's books and the underlying documents on any related deal. I invoked the audit right first, in writing, through Keel Point's counsel, Dale, so Blake still had no idea the anonymous LP was me. He got a formal demand from Keel Point Holdings for records related to affiliated transactions, including any deal in which Tidewater or its principals had an interest in the counterparty, including Harbor Reach Logistics. I could picture him reading it. I could picture the tan draining out. Third, we built the record. I already had the Virginia filing showing Harbor Reach was formed 5 weeks before he pitched it, with a registered agent address that tied back to Tidewater's own shells. Now, through the audit demand, we got the escrow account records, and they showed my $200,000 hadn't gone to any warehouse in Chesapeake. It had cycled through Harbor Reach's account and out, $140,000 to a Tidewater operating account to cover a margin call on Blake's credit line, $28,000 to the Annapolis Yacht Club for 2 years of slip fees on the second wind, and the rest to a personal account. There was no shipping company. There was a boat and a margin call. My savings had paid Blake's debts and docked his yacht. Fourth, and this is the part that still makes my throat tight, Junie came back. She showed up at my door on a Tuesday in April, no makeup, in the gray Loyola hoodie she'd had since college, and when I opened it, she was already crying. "I found the angel's envy," she said, which made no sense until it did. Blake had thrown out the bourbon he kept for me, and Junie had found the bottle in the recycling and stood in her kitchen and understood, in that stupid, small way that truth finally arrives, that her husband had erased me on purpose. Then she'd started looking. She'd found a folder on his home office desktop labeled, of all things, HR Logistics Final, with 3 versions of the pitch deck and a document that tracked, in a spreadsheet, exactly how much he'd need to raise from IC to cover the Q1 margin call. "IC," she whispered on my porch. "That's you. He built it around you, and he used me to do it. I sat there and I held your hand, and I told you it was safe, Imogen. I vouched." She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. "I gave him my face to rob you with." I brought her inside. I made her tea because it was Junie, and Junie drinks chamomile when she's wrecked. And I did the hardest thing, harder than the whole legal machine. I told her the truth. That I wasn't just his victim, that I was his cornerstone, that the fund he'd built his whole self on ran, at the bottom, on my money, and that by the end of the quarter, I was going to pull the thread and let the whole thing stand up and fall over at once, lawfully, cleanly, with him watching. Junie was quiet a long time. The ship in a bottle sat on the sill between us, its fogged green glass catching the last of the porch-adjacent light. She reached out and touched the bottle, gently, like it might wake. "My grandfather said you build it flat," I told her. "Then you pull one thread and it all stands up at once." "What do you need from me?" she said. I didn't want to use her. I told her so, but she shook her head. "He used my face. I want to be there when the real one shows up." And she gave me the one thing that made it airtight, the desktop folder, the spreadsheet. IC, a forensic copy Dale had a specialist pull, so the chain of custody was spotless. My conscience witness. The one person from inside his own house who chose the truth. We set the date. The redemption notice would land and the reckoning would come. At the place Blake loved most in the world, the annual Annapolis Yacht Club Charity Regatta fundraiser, the last Saturday of the quarter, June 28th, where he'd be at his shiniest, in front of everyone whose opinion he'd bought. The tent went up on the club lawn overlooking Spa Creek, white peaks against a sky the color of a nickel. 300 people in blazers and sundresses, a silent auction, a jazz trio, and the second wind bobbing at her slip like the guest of honor. Blake was in his element, gold pocket square, working the room, a flute of veuve in his hand. Junie was on his arm in a navy dress, playing the part one last time, and only I knew what was behind her eyes. I wore gray. I stood near the raw bar. In my clutch was a single sealed envelope and my phone. And in an SUV in the parking lot sat Dale Okonkwo, licorice in the console, on the phone with the funds administrator, waiting for one text from me. At 7:15, Blake tapped his flute for the toast. He thanked the Commodore. He thanked the sponsors. He made a joke about the wind. And then, because he could never resist, because contempt is a con man's only true tell, he found me across the tent and lifted his glass a half-inch and said, to the people near him, but loud enough to carry, "Some people take, some people build. Glad we know the difference now." The stillness came over me, cold, complete, familiar, the stillness of the footnote. I walked over. I didn't raise my voice. I have never once in this entire story raised my voice at Blake Renner. "Blake," I said, "congratulations on the LP renewal. Keel Point, $22 million. You always said it changed everything." His smile held, but his eyes did a small thing, a flinch, because the anonymous LP's name was not something I should have known. "How do you—" "I sent you a redemption notice 61 days ago," I said, "through counsel, Keel Point Holdings. You've been ignoring it, or your controller has, because you thought it was a formality." I opened my clutch and took out the envelope and set it on the high-top table between us. "This is the acceleration notice. As of the close of business today, the last day of the quarter, Keel Point is calling its full commitment and withdrawing as your anchor limited partner on grounds of material misrepresentation. The Harbor Reach misrepresentation. There's a schedule attached with the escrow records. You'll recognize the $140,000. The veuve flute was still in his hand. I watched a bead of condensation run down it and drop. "Keel Point is a fund," he said. His voice had changed. "It's institutional." It's a trust," I said, "advised by an LLC in Baltimore. You met the advisor at your own engagement party. You called her the Brains. I have read a lot of faces going still. I have never watched the blood leave one so completely." Blake Renner turned the color of the tent. His mouth opened and nothing came out, and behind him the jazz trio kept playing something light and awful, and the little sails on Spa Creek kept catching the last silver light, and 300 people kept laughing at other tables, and none of them knew that the fund they thought made this man was, at the bottom of 3 holding companies, mine. "You," he said. It came out as almost nothing. "Me," I said. "I was your cornerstone, Blake. Your whole leverage stood on my capital. Your credit lines, your 80 million, your boat, your ring, all of it stood up on a thread I owned." I nodded at the envelope. "And by the end of the quarter, which is in 4 hours and 45 minutes, I've pulled it." I texted Dale one word: now. It doesn't happen with an explosion. That's the thing about a fund collapsing on lost leverage. It happens with phone calls. Within the hour, Tidewater's prime broker, who'd been quietly notified through counsel that the Anchor LP had accelerated its full $22 million and that a material misrepresentation claim was of record, pulled the credit line. Without the Anchor capital, Tidewater was in breach of its covenants by 9 p.m. The margin desk did not care about the regatta. By Monday, the fund was frozen. By the following Friday, July 4th weekend, Tidewater Partners was in wind down, and Blake Renner was a man standing on a lawn next to a boat he could no longer pay the slip fee on. But that's the machinery. What I'll keep is the tent. What I'll keep is Blake. gold pocket square, reaching for my arm and saying, "Imogen, wait, we can. Let's talk, we're family, please." The word please cracking in the middle, the con man's mask finally off, and nothing behind it but a frightened man who'd bet everything he had on the idea that the brains would never look at the neck of the bottle. What I'll keep is Junie stepping back from his arm quietly in her navy dress and saying, not loud, just clear, "I found the folder, Blake. I see. I read the spreadsheet." And walking across the tent to stand next to me, not as my collateral, as my friend come home. What I'll keep is that I said nothing else. I picked up the envelope's copy for my records and I left it, the original, on the high-top table for him, and I walked out of the tent past the silent auction and the jazz trio, and the last thing I heard was Blake Renner saying my name to a room that had, 4 months ago, turned its carts around in the cereal aisle. This time, nobody nodded. Dale was in the SUV eating licorice. "It's done," she said. "Get in. You did it clean." I got everything back. That's the part that matters, and I'll say it plainly because plainness is the whole point. The forensic records and the Virginia filings made the case airtight. Blake's own escrow account had spelled out where my $200,000 went, in his own transfers. Faced with the acceleration claim, the audit trail, and the IC spreadsheet, his new lawyer, Pruitt was long gone, advised him to settle everything, rather than let a court and the state securities regulator take it apart in public. I recovered my $200,000 in full, plus interest, plus fees. Keel Point's $22 million came home to the trust unharmed, and the Maryland Securities Division opened its own file on Tidewater's Harbor Reach placement, which was no longer any of my concern and entirely his. The defamation dissolved on its own, the way a lie does when the paper underneath it turns out to say the opposite. The people who'd turned away came back with sheepish emails I didn't answer. I didn't need them. I'd never had them. I'd had Junie, and I had her again. They divorced by autumn. Junie kept the house on Chinkapin Round. Blake got the second wind and nowhere to dock it. Last I heard, he'd moved to a rental outside Richmond and was consulting. The man who managed over $80 million manages now the arithmetic kind of money, the kind where you round the gas pump down to leave a buffer. I don't gloat about it. I don't have to. The paper did it. Here's the warm part, because there is one, and it's the part I'd keep over all the rest. In September, I opened my own shop, not the quiet LLC anymore, a real office, my name on the glass door on West Street in Annapolis, 8 blocks from the duplex with the flickering porch light where I grew up, Cole Capital. 600 square feet, a good window, a view of nothing but a parking meter and a bakery, and it is entirely, legally, unmistakably mine. Junie helped me move in on a Saturday in the gray Loyola hoodie, and we ordered crab cakes, hot ones this time, the Old Bay smell a good smell again, instead of the smell of that February night. And Dale came by with a bottle of Angel's Envy and her jar of black licorice as a housewarming gift, and we drank a toast on folding chairs because the real furniture hadn't come yet. "To the brains," Dale said, and this time the word landed the right way up. Junie couldn't stop crying, the good kind. "I gave him my face to rob you," she said again, because she still carries it. And I told her what I'll keep telling her until she believes it, that she didn't lose me $1, that her face was never the collateral, his lie was, that I got every cent back and I got her back, and only one of those was ever in doubt. The one generous thing I did? I set up a small fund, $50,000, in the trust's name, quiet, to make whole the other people Blake had told his 13% story to. The Mrs. Delano's, the widow he'd once called emotional at a Thanksgiving table, anonymously, through a holding company. Nobody will ever know it was me, which is exactly how I like it. You build it flat, where nobody can see, and you don't need the credit. My grandfather taught me that too. I'd brought one thing from home to the new office before anything else, before the desk, before the sign. I unwrapped it from a dish towel and held it up to the parking meter light. My grandfather's ship in a bottle, the little three-masted clipper still sailing through 60 years of fog, the green glass smudged soft with every fingerprint of every windowsill it had ever known. Patience and rigging. You build it flat, then you pull one thread, and it all stands up at once. I set the ship in a bottle on the shelf of my own new office, where the afternoon light could find it, and I turned it once until the little ship faced the harbor, and I left it there to sail.